Bears are some of the most powerful animals on Earth, and when they cross paths with people, the results can be terrifying. From frozen Arctic ice to mountain trails, from quiet rivers to busy roads, these animals have struck without warning. They have torn through homes, crushed trucks, stormed kitchens, and even broken into hospitals. Each attack left behind broken bodies, shattered places, and unforgettable fear. Yet in every story, survival came down to quick thinking and pure strength. In this video, we'll dive into 6 chilling tales of bear attacks on humans, exploring the harrowing encounters and the resilience of those who survived. On July 9th, 2025, the quiet town of Kodiak, Alaska, carried on with its usual rhythm at a small roadside fuel stop, where families, workers, and travelers often gathered. Among the people present that day were longtime residents and passers-by simply looking to fill their tanks or grab quick supplies. Some were regulars who knew the staff well, while others were strangers passing through on their way to the harbor. The workers inside, including young clerks stacking shelves and an older cashier behind the counter, kept the station in order as the steady flow of customers came and went. The building itself was modest, lined with coolers and snack aisles, its automatic doors sliding open with every arrival. Outside, pumps clicked steadily as cars refueled under the bright summer sky. For those present, it felt like any ordinary moment in a community accustomed to both the beauty and risks of living in bear country. Without warning, the calm was shattered when a massive Kodiak bear emerged from the nearby woods, drawn by the strong smell of food and lingering fuel in the air. The sheer size of the animal dwarfed the doorway, its weight cracking the frame as it surged forward with unstoppable force. Glass exploded as the sliding doors burst apart, raining shards across the floor. The impact shook the aisles, sending bottles tumbling and shelves swaying violently. In seconds, what had been a normal stop for groceries and fuel turned into chaos as the bear pushed through, swiping at anything in its path. Papers flew, displays collapsed, and the building filled with the heavy sound of claws scraping against metal and tile. 6 customers were caught in the sudden violence. One man barely had time to react before the animal's paw raked across his arm, leaving long open wounds and knocking him to the ground. Another was slammed against a wall so hard the shelves behind him splintered. A third was cornered near the refrigerators, his leg torn open as he tried desperately to shield himself. Each swipe of the bear left trails of blood, deep cuts, and broken bones. A younger woman tripped in her rush to escape and was dragged briefly along the floor before the beast shifted toward another target. Behind the counter, a customer attempting to duck for cover found himself pinned as the desk cracked beneath the force of the animal pressing down. The air filled with screams and the shrill wail of alarms as employees scrambled to trigger every emergency system they could. The creature growled fiercely, its roars echoing louder than the sirens. Shards of glass and scattered goods littered the ground, making every step dangerous for those trying to move. One staff member grabbed a canister of deterrent spray and released a cloud, forcing the animal to recoil for only a moment before it struck again, smashing through a row of products and hurling debris across the store. Customers scrambled for cover behind aisles and counters, their hearts racing as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the bear's looming shadow dominating the ruined station. The chaos pressed on until a group of workers seized whatever tools they could to force the giant animal away from the trapped people. Fire extinguishers hissed as white spray filled the air, mixing with smoke from a broken alarm system. The loud blare of car horns outside carried through the shattered walls, and the heavy noise made the animal hesitate. In that pause, several victims were dragged behind counters and aisles to safety by others still able to move. With another furious roar, the bear smashed one last display of supplies, then turned sharply toward the broken entrance. Its broad frame forced through the doors, leaving splintered glass and twisted metal in its wake. Seconds later, the massive figure vanished into the trees beyond the lot, disappearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Yet the silence it left behind carried more weight than its roars. The damage was immense. 6 people were left wounded, their clothes torn and skin marked by deep gashes. One lay near the pumps outside, ribs fractured and face pale from shock. Another clutched a ruined arm, bleeding heavily as others wrapped whatever cloth they could find to slow the loss. Across the room, a woman with torn legs tried to sit upright, struggling to breathe steadily. A man pulled from behind the counter gasped through broken ribs, his chest rising and falling in short, painful bursts. Others lay scattered on the floor, bruised and bloodied, each one trying to endure the agony until help arrived. Pools of red stained the tiles, and every step echoed with crunching glass and fallen debris. Rescue crews reached the site soon after alarms alerted nearby authorities. Paramedics rushed inside, stepping carefully over wreckage while assessing the survivors. The injured were stabilized with bandages, tourniquets, and oxygen masks before being lifted onto stretchers. Sirens wailed again as ambulances carried them toward the local hospital, where surgeons prepared for hours of work. Broken bones required steel plates, torn muscles demanded stitching, and blood transfusions were given to those who had lost too much strength. Although every person attacked lived through the ordeal, the recovery ahead would demand months of therapy and repeated surgeries. Outside, wildlife officers arrived with rifles and tracking gear, searching the forest for the massive predator. Experts explained that animals of such size rarely approached human structures unless drawn by strong sense of food or unusual curiosity. The incident highlighted how dangerous a meeting with such a powerful creature could become in mere moments. Reports noted that the bear's behavior was not strictly predatory, but driven by opportunity, making it unpredictable and extremely dangerous in crowded areas. In the following weeks, new rules were placed around local stations and stores. Garbage bins were reinforced. Food deliveries were secured more tightly, and noise alarms were installed to scare away curious animals. Residents spoke about the horror of that afternoon for months afterward, remembering the screams, the crashing glass, and the sight of a creature so powerful that nothing seemed able to stop it. The people injured carried scars both on their bodies and in their minds, but their survival stood as proof of quick action and determination to endure against overwhelming force. On July 14, 2025, Ronan Mercer, a skilled outdoorsman with years of paddling experience, set out on a solo journey through a winding gorge in Montana. Since his teenage years, he had grown attached to the wilderness, often traveling alone into remote rivers and lakes to capture moments of peace and beauty. He was not only a kayaker, but also a photographer who believed the water carried secrets worth recording. Known by friends as patient and careful, he trained himself to respect wild terrain and always carried safety equipment. His life jacket, paddle, and a small emergency kit were part of his routine, along with knowledge of currents and weather shifts. Although no stranger to challenges, he had never faced what was waiting for him on that summer day. The narrow gorge he entered was alive with echoes of rushing water, its banks littered with branches and fish remains carried down from earlier storms. The sound of paddles dipping into cold currents blended with the cries of distant birds circling the cliffs. The air was sharp and filled with the scent of moss and wet stone. Ronan steered carefully between jagged rocks, his kayak gliding smoothly across the surface. Unseen by him, a powerful grizzly lingered near the shore, drawn by the smell of salmon carcasses scattered along the riverbank. The animal's size and strength were immense, and its presence turned the calm setting into a hidden danger. Without warning, the beast surged from the side, charging down the bank with force that shook the ground. Before Ronan could react, the bear's paw slammed into his kayak, splintering plastic and sending shards into the river. The impact flipped the vessel, throwing him into the freezing water. The shock of the cold nearly stole his breath, but there was no time to recover. Claws ripped across his jacket, tearing fabric and scraping his ribs beneath. Each strike carried the weight of survival against unstoppable strength. He fought to stay afloat as the current pushed him into rocks sharp enough to cut through skin. With desperate effort, Ronan clutched his paddle, holding it across his chest like a shield. The grizzly lunged again, swiping with enough power to jolt his body back under the surface. He gasped for air between strikes, blood from fresh gashes staining the current around him. His arms and shoulders throbbed with pain as deep wounds opened, but he forced the paddle upward each time the bear closed in. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself had slowed to measure his struggle against overwhelming odds. The gorge amplified every sound: the roar of the beast, the crack of broken plastic, the splash of his frantic movements. The fight dragged on through minutes that seemed endless. The rushing water carried fragments of the kayak downstream, while the battle between man and animal raged in the heart of the icy current. What followed tested every ounce of his endurance, and threatened to decide if he would survive the river that tried to claim him. The struggle carried on until the roar of breaking stone echoed above. A sheet of loose rock collapsed from the cliff, tumbling into the river with a crash. The sudden noise startled the grizzly, sending ripples of hesitation through its charge. For a moment, the predator stepped back, its wet fur glistening in the light as it weighed the threat of the falling debris. That pause gave Ronan a chance to push toward the edge of the river, his body trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed as he dragged himself across slippery stones, his paddle still clutched in a bleeding hand. The cold water clung to his clothing, pulling heat from his body with alarming speed. His vision blurred, and each breath cut deeper into his lungs. He stumbled onto a patch of uneven ground, leaving streaks of red across sharp rocks. The bear prowled at a distance, still restless, but no longer lunging forward. Splashes from the falling rubble seemed to unsettle it, while Ronan's frantic movements added confusion to the moment. At last, the animal turned back toward the bank, growling as it retreated into the cover of trees, leaving only silence behind. Ronan collapsed on the gravel, barely conscious, his life jacket torn nearly to shreds. His arms and shoulders burned from deep wounds. His chest ached from bruises, and his ribs throbbed as if struck by hammers. The freezing current had drained nearly all his strength. Yet with sheer determination, he forced himself to crawl higher up the riverbank. Each motion was slow and deliberate, his body shaking from blood loss and the cold pressing against his skin. The once peaceful gorge was now marked by splintered plastic, smeared trails, and the aftermath of a fight few could endure. The sound of rushing water blended with the distant calls of birds, masking his weak gasps. Ronan waved his bright paddle toward the sky, hoping for any sign of help. His hand trembled violently, but the orange blade glinted in the sun, cutting through the wilderness with a faint signal. Hours seemed to drag, but his effort did not go unseen. A search helicopter, conducting a routine survey of the region, spotted the unusual flash and circled lower. The crew quickly realized the seriousness of the scene below. Rescuers descended, moving swiftly to secure him before his fading strength gave way. They applied first aid, stabilizing his injuries as best they could, then lifted him aboard for evacuation. His eyes fluttered shut, but not before he recognized the hum of the machine as a sign of survival. In the days that followed, doctors confirmed the extent of his wounds. Several deep cuts, a broken rib, and frostbite from prolonged exposure. Surgeries repaired torn muscle, while treatment addressed severe shock and hypothermia. News of the event spread quickly, becoming a striking reminder of the dangers rivers conceal when predators roam close to food sources. Wildlife experts explain that grizzlies in salmon-fed regions often act with fierce aggression. Ronan's case showed that even the most prepared adventurer can be caught in a storm of survival within seconds. His persistence, matched with the fortune of timely rescue, transformed a near-fatal encounter into a lasting story of endurance in one of nature's harshest landscapes. On October 14, 2024, the frozen air of northern Canada carried the sharp sting of wind across a sea of white ice. Elsa Thorson had built her life around the extremes of wild places. She was a photographer who had spent years traveling across frozen coasts, documenting animals few people would ever see up close. Born to a family of sailors in Norway, she grew up with the call of the sea and the sound of storms. Later, she pursued the silence of glaciers and the sight of great northern predators. Each expedition hardened her, yet also carried risk, for the land she loved held both beauty and danger. This journey placed her alongside a helicopter crew, tasked with delivering supplies to an isolated research base, surrounded by endless sheets of ice. Her work required long hours of waiting, often in freezing temperatures, with little separation between her and the creatures that ruled the Arctic. The day began with the steady beat of rotor blades slicing through pale skies as the aircraft lowered toward the drop zone. Snow swirled in circles around the landing site, where stacked crates of fuel, food, and tools were lowered onto the frozen ground. Elsa moved among the crew, camera in hand, trying to capture the stark contrast of human machinery set against untouched wilderness. But in the stillness beyond the whirling noise, a figure watched. Hidden within a snowdrift, a massive polar bear lingered, drawn by the scent of stored goods and the promise of easy calories at the edge of survival season. The animal moved with quiet power, its white coat blending into the terrain. Few noticed until it closed the distance in sudden bursts of speed. Without warning, the predator surged forward, its bulk crashing across the ice. Elsa, turning to adjust her lens, found herself at the center of the charge. The paw of the bear struck her hip and shoulder with shocking force, the impact tearing through the thick layers of her insulated jacket. Pain radiated across her side as she fell onto the slick surface, her back scraping harshly against frozen ridges. The bear's growl filled the air as crew members scattered across the supply field in panic. Elsa rolled, struggling to regain her balance, but the weight of her injuries slowed every motion. The animal circled, swiping at her legs with claws that carved shallow lines into her clothing and skin. The ice beneath her offered no grip, and each attempt to rise only slid her closer to danger. Her camera clattered onto the ground, forgotten in the urgency of survival. Reaching for the emergency kit strapped to her belt, Elsa tore free a flare. With trembling hands she fired, and a burst of light split the gloom. The bright flash startled the bear, forcing it back for a moment. Its eyes narrowed, unsettled by the glare, but hunger and instinct soon pulled it forward again. It lowered its head and advanced, pacing around the crates as Elsa clung to the steel edges for cover. The helicopter's rotors thundered above, lifting slightly as the pilot prepared to act. Yet on the ice below, the struggle had not ended, and the bear remained only steps away, ready for another strike. The helicopter hovered as the predator circled the field, each heavy step sinking into the crust of snow. Elsa clung tightly to the crate, her body aching from bruises and torn muscles, while the icy wind cut across her face. The flare's glow had faded, leaving smoke drifting into the pale sky. For a moment the animal hesitated, unsettled by the roaring machine above, but its attention returned quickly to the figure crouched below. Instinct urged it to press forward, testing the strange shape trembling against the supplies. As it lunged, Elsa forced herself upward, dragging her frame across the top of the crate. The sharp edges cut into her hands, but the height gave her a slim chance. The pilot, realizing the danger, shifted the helicopter closer, lowering a skid within reach. With effort, Elsa stretched toward the cold metal bar, her body screaming with pain. At that instant, the bear reared and struck, claws raking across her leg, leaving blood that quickly darkened against the snow. Still, she managed to catch the skid, pulling herself upward as the machine lifted, carrying her beyond the immediate reach of the predator. Below, the animal stood glaring, its breath steaming in the frigid air. It paced around the scattered cargo, swiping at boxes and tearing into wrappings, leaving broken wood and plastic across the ice. The crew watched in tense silence, holding their position until the bear finally retreated toward distant ridges, leaving a trail of crushed snow behind. Inside the aircraft, Elsa collapsed, her chest heaving as shock set in. Pain spread from her hip to her ribs, and her leg throbbed with each heartbeat. The cold slowed the bleeding, but her condition remained serious. The helicopter crew secured bandages while radioing for urgent medical aid. Each jolt of turbulence sent fresh waves of agony through her fractured bones, yet she clung to consciousness, unwilling to fade before reaching help. Hours later, she was flown to a small Arctic clinic where doctors treated deep lacerations, stitched torn muscle, and confirmed multiple broken bones. Her parka had been shredded, leaving fabric stiff with frozen stains. The recovery process stretched ahead of her, filled with surgeries, therapy, and months of healing. Survival itself was remarkable, for few who face such power at close distance escape with life. News of the encounter spread quickly, drawing attention from wildlife experts studying the growing risk of polar bears seeking human-related food sources. Researchers explained how scarcity late in the season often drives predators closer to supply camps, stations, and vessels. What had once been rare was becoming more common, a sign of how shifting conditions placed both people and animals into sudden conflict. For Elsa, the memory remained carved into her body and her spirit. Every scar told the story of that day when the silent ice gave way to a sudden charge. Though she had faced storms, seas, and endless nights in frozen lands, nothing equaled the raw force of the bear that nearly ended her work forever. The event became more than a personal trial. It became a lesson to crews across the Arctic that no mission, no matter how routine, could ignore the watchful presence of predators who share the same unforgiving land. On July 14, 2025, the quiet village of Amur Krai stirred awake under heavy gray skies, where the lone clinic stood as the only medical point for miles. Among the familiar faces of the community was Sergei Malenkov, a local officer who carried the weight of duty with quiet resolve. Known for helping neighbors in emergencies, he had grown up in this rugged land where wild animals and people often lived side by side. Years in service had taught him caution, yet he was also marked by a deep sense of responsibility. That morning he accompanied a patient toward the modest hospital, never suspecting that fate would draw him into one of the most violent tragedies the settlement had ever faced. The building itself was small, with narrow halls and a single reception area where staff moved quickly between tasks. Outside, the noise of construction equipment echoed as workers repaired pipes, while a delivery truck unloaded supplies near the side entrance. The mixture of food scents, loud activity, and unusual commotion carried into the nearby trees. Within the shadows of that forest lurked a giant grizzly, unsettled and driven by instinct. Its powerful frame shifted forward, following the aroma of goods and the disturbance that broke the normal silence of the land. The heavy door burst open with startling force as the beast pushed inside, glass splintering and wooden frames breaking apart, papers scattered like snowflakes while cabinets rattled from the impact. The waiting area became a storm of confusion as screams filled the air. The creature's immense weight smashed the reception desk, sending pens, charts, and medicines across the floor. For a brief instant, the staff froze in disbelief before panic spread through every corner. Sergei's focus remained fixed on shielding the patient at his side. As the predator advanced, its massive paw swung with bone-crushing power, pinning him against the wall. The sound of claws tearing through cloth and flesh cut across the chaos, leaving his body marked with deep punctures and torn muscle. Blood spread across his uniform, while broken ribs cracked under the brute force of repeated swipes. Despite the unbearable pain, he struggled to keep the attention away from those still fleeing into the safety of side rooms. The injured patient stumbled clear as Sergei's final efforts held the animal's fury. The grizzly reared high, roaring through the narrow space, its breath steaming against the walls. Furniture toppled, cabinets splintered, and the crash of falling objects echoed through the hall. Staff and frightened villagers slammed doors shut, turning exam rooms into barricaded shelters. Inside those makeshift strongholds, trembling hands held back tears as the roars shook their fragile walls. In those few moments, the modest hospital was transformed into a battleground. Sergei's strength began to fade as the claws carved into his chest, his body collapsing under the relentless attack. The building shuddered from the clash of beast against man, while the air filled with cries, breaking glass, and the raw thunder of nature unleashed. The fight seemed endless, until an unexpected sound outside began to shift the balance. The deep growls and heavy stomps inside the building faltered, when the harsh pounding of machinery from the worksite outside cut through the air. The metallic grind and steady hammering echoed across the walls, clashing with the bear's roars. The predator hesitated, its head snapping toward the unfamiliar vibrations. For several tense seconds, the massive figure moved in a restless circle, claws raking across the tile, before turning toward the broken entrance. With a final crash against a toppled chair, the animal pushed its way back through the shattered doorway and lumbered into the forest. What remained in the aftermath was a silence broken only by shallow breaths and muffled cries behind locked doors. The waiting room was a ruin, its furniture smashed, walls marked with blood, and glass fragments crunching under every step. Nurses and villagers emerged slowly, their faces pale, as they gathered near the motionless body slumped against the wall. Sergei lay where the beast had left him, his chest torn and his eyes closed, his final act marked by the shield he had provided for the others. The patient he had guided into safety clutched the doorframe, unable to speak as shock spread across the room. Word of the attack traveled quickly through the settlement. Men and women who had known Sergei since childhood crowded the small clinic, their grief mixing with fear. For many, he had been a figure of trust, often the first to answer when trouble called. His passing left a hollow silence that echoed louder than the construction noises still rumbling beyond the trees. The workers who had unknowingly saved lives with their machinery now stood in disbelief, realizing the terror their presence had ended. Authorities arrived later, inspecting the damage and marking claw marks on doors, desks, and even the floor tiles. Wildlife officers explained that bears in this region often grew more aggressive during late summer, when human activity and food storage attracted them closer to villages. The combination of fresh supplies, loud building work, and open entrances had created the perfect storm. Still, no one in the village had expected such violence within the walls of their hospital, a place once seen as untouchable by the wilderness around it. Funeral preparations began within hours, candles placed near the clinic as neighbors gathered in silence. The memory of Sergei's final stand became a story repeated among families, told not with fear, but with respect for the man who gave his strength to protect another. Doctors and nurses, though shaken, returned to their posts, cleaning the destroyed reception area and restoring order where chaos had spread. Broken cabinets were nailed shut, shattered windows covered with boards, and alarms checked more carefully than ever before. In the days that followed, experts from larger cities visited to advise the community on safety measures, warning that as forests shrink and food grows scarce, bears may push further into human spaces. For the people of Amur Krai, the hospital attack stood as a reminder that survival in remote lands was not only about enduring the cold and distance, but also about living beside untamed giants. Sergei's sacrifice remained carved into the memory of the village, a story of bravery born in the most fragile of places. On August 14, 2025, in the quiet woods of the Adirondack Mountains, a small lodge stood hidden between tall pines and winding rivers. The owner, Maris Calloway, had lived there for more than 20 years. She was known locally as a woman who loved the forest deeply, running her fishing lodge for travelers and hunters who came to enjoy the lakes and streams. Each season, she prepared hearty meals, kept her cabins warm with carefully stacked firewood, and told visitors stories of the wild landscape surrounding them. Her days were long, yet filled with peace, as she carried out endless chores and welcomed guests who often became lifelong friends. Living far from towns had shaped her into a resilient figure, someone accustomed to silence broken only by wind, rain, or the steady rush of water over stone. Maris had grown up in a nearby village before taking ownership of the lodge her parents once managed. From a young age, she learned to split wood, catch trout, and repair broken tools with her own hands. Her love for the wilderness only deepened with age, though she never underestimated its dangers. Black bears, common in the region, had crossed her path more than once. Usually she saw them from a safe distance, slipping silently across trails or wandering near the lodge at night in search of food scraps. She always kept her supplies locked away and warned visitors about the risks of leaving meals unattended. But even careful habits could be tested, especially when the smell of food carried far on the mountain air. That evening, the scent of smoked fish drifted across the clearing as Maris worked in her kitchen. Outside, a portion of supplies still waited to be stored away. Unnoticed by her, the rich aroma had already reached the keen senses of a bear roaming the nearby forest. The large animal moved silently out of the trees, drawn by hunger and curiosity. Its massive body pressed against the lodge's rear door, and with a sudden crash, the wooden frame splintered. Splinters scattered as the bear forced its way inside, claws gouging into the old floorboards as it entered. Maris turned at the sound, her heart freezing. Before she could react, the bear barreled into the small kitchen, scattering chairs, smashing cabinets, and toppling the heavy wood stove. Pots clattered across the floor, embers spilled from the stove, and the once orderly room descended into chaos. She tried to retreat, but the bear's paw struck with brutal force, slashing through her jacket and tearing into the skin beneath. She stumbled backward into a pile of firewood, gasping as pain surged through her chest and shoulder. The animal pressed forward without hesitation. It lunged again, its jaws closing around her leg. The crushing grip left deep wounds that sent waves of agony through her body. Pinned against the woodpile, she struggled for breath, her body weakening under the sheer weight and power of the attack. Her hands searched desperately for anything within reach. Her fingers brushed against the handle of a cast-iron pan lying near the fallen stove. Summoning every fragment of strength, she lifted it and swung hard. The pan cracked against the bear's skull with a resounding clang. The noise echoed through the broken lodge. The bear staggered back, momentarily stunned, shaking its massive head. Blood streamed from Maris's cuts as she dragged herself toward the corner, where an old radio sat on a low shelf. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, even as the bear turned again, circling the ruined kitchen. The beast lunged once more, claws raking across her legs. She struck again with the pan, hitting its snout, just enough to gain another desperate second. Her hand twisted the radio dial, static filling the air while streaks of blood smeared across the wooden floor. With fading strength, she pressed the call button, sending fragmented signals out into the night. Growls behind her reminded her that her fight was not yet over. She braced herself, convinced the next charge would finish her, but the animal suddenly shifted. With a final low rumble, it turned, retreating through the shattered doorway and fading back into the shadowed forest. The scent of smoke, spilled food, and blood lingered heavily as silence reclaimed the room. Maris slumped against the wall, her breath sharp and uneven. Cuts covered her arms, her shoulder throbbed, and her leg bled steadily from the bite. Around her, the kitchen was unrecognizable. Cabinets splintered, glass shattered, the stove toppled, and the floor littered with wreckage. The smell of iron mixed with ash filled the air. Hours blurred together as she drifted in and out of consciousness, the faint hum of static still whispering from the radio. Rescue came deep into the night. A ranger team arrived after catching her faint signal. They found her collapsed on the floor, weak but alive. They bandaged her wounds quickly and carried her to their vehicle, beginning the long journey to the nearest hospital miles away. Her clothing hung in tatters, soaked with blood, while her body bore the unmistakable marks of teeth and claws. Though her pain was overwhelming, her eyes stayed open, determined to survive. Surgeons worked for hours once she reached the hospital. Deep gashes across her arm and shoulder required dozens of stitches, while her leg needed surgical repair to mend the crushed muscle left by the bite. Broken ribs from the bear's first strike made each breath a struggle. Recovery came slowly, marked by pain and exhaustion, yet her will never faltered. Word of the ordeal spread quickly through the surrounding region. Other lodge owners were cautioned about the danger of leaving food outside, and officials reminded residents that even black bears, though smaller than grizzlies, could cause devastating injuries when emboldened by human scents. The lodge was later repaired, though scars from the attack remained etched into the wooden walls. Maris spent weeks in rehabilitation, learning to walk again while carrying the memory of that night in her body and mind. She knew how close she had come to death, yet she also knew her survival came from quick thinking, raw determination, and the refusal to give in. On October 14, 2025, the early morning air in Montana was crisp and heavy with silence. Emmett Harlow, a seasoned outdoorsman, had spent years exploring the rugged wilderness that stretched across the mountains and valleys. Born and raised in a small town nearby, he had grown up learning to hunt, fish, and survive in the wild. His reputation among locals was that of a skilled tracker who respected nature deeply. Though experienced, he was never careless. Emmett often reminded others that the wild was both beautiful and unpredictable. That morning, he parked his worn pickup truck along a remote trail, planning another long hunt in familiar country. The back of the vehicle carried supplies, gear, and bait he would use later in the day. As the first light broke over the tree line, Emmett moved slowly, unloading equipment and checking his rifle. The forest around him seemed calm, with only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind breaking the stillness. What he did not realize was that the faint scent of bait resting in the open truck bed had traveled far. From deep within the trees, a massive grizzly had caught the smell and wandered closer. With each step, its heavy paws pressed into the soil, silent yet purposeful, until the towering animal reached the clearing where the truck stood. Before Emmett could turn, the bear surged forward with tremendous force. It slammed into the side of the truck, the sound of metal twisting echoing across the trail. The driver's side door crumpled under the weight, and glass from the windows shattered into shards that scattered across the dirt. The pickup rocked violently, its frame dented and bent as if it were made of thin tin. Supplies spilled from the bed, tumbling onto the ground as the beast clawed furiously at the cab. Emmett instinctively tried to back away, but the bear's speed was overwhelming. With one powerful swipe, its claws ripped across his chest and shoulder, tearing through clothing and skin in a single strike. Pain shot through his body as ribs cracked under the force. He stumbled backward, breath stolen from his lungs, while blood began to soak his shirt. The grizzly roared, rearing back before striking again, its paw leaving fresh wounds along his torso. Desperate and struggling to remain on his feet, Emmett reached for the knife at his side. As the bear lunged once more, he thrust the blade forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The sharp steel pierced the animal's thick hide, surprising it and forcing it to hesitate. Its momentum faltered for just a moment, and that moment saved his life. Gritting his teeth, he slashed again, pushing the beast back just enough to create space. Seizing the brief chance, Emmett dragged himself into the dense woods nearby. His movements were slow and strained, each step leaving a trail of blood on the earth. Behind him, the bear remained near the wrecked truck, circling and growling, but no longer pressing forward. Emmett clutched his side, fighting to stay conscious, his only thought now focused on survival. He stumbled deeper into the cover of the forest, every step burning with pain. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred from the loss of blood. The sharp edges of branches scraped against his skin as he tried to stay hidden. Behind him, the grizzly circled the battered truck, sniffing and pacing, but the lure of food kept it distracted. The hunter pressed onward, guided only by instinct and the need to endure. His body felt heavier with each passing moment, yet his will to keep moving forced his legs forward. The dense trees finally gave way to a small ridge where he collapsed to the ground. His clothes were torn, soaked with dark stains spreading across the fabric. He fought to remain conscious, forcing himself to wave his arm toward the open sky, hoping someone might see movement. Hours felt like days as he lay there, the cold air tightening around him. But luck turned when a distant hiker caught sight of the wrecked truck and raised the alarm. Rescue crews were alerted, and within time, a helicopter roared above the valley. Medics rushed to Emmett's side, lifting him carefully onto a stretcher. His injuries were severe, with broken bones and deep gashes across his chest and shoulder. Every bump of the stretcher made him groan, yet relief washed over him as the helicopter lifted away from the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. The flight carried him swiftly to a regional hospital, where surgeons worked tirelessly through the night. Hours of surgery followed as doctors closed wounds, stabilized fractures, and treated internal bleeding. The fight to keep him alive was just as fierce as the struggle he had faced in the woods. News of the attack spread quickly through the nearby towns. Residents were shaken. Many who knew Emmett personally felt a mix of fear and respect for the wild animals that lived so close to human settlements. Authorities examined the damaged truck, its sides dented and glass shattered, as a stark reminder of the force the grizzly had unleashed. Wildlife officers patrolled the area to track the bear, warning hunters and hikers to stay cautious until the animal moved away from human trails. Weeks passed as Emmett remained in recovery. His chest bore long scars, and his ribs took months to heal. Physical therapy became part of his daily routine, helping him regain strength in his arms and shoulders. Pain lingered, but he refused to let it keep him from standing again. Friends and family visited often, bringing encouragement and stories to lift his spirits. Though he had faced the jaws of death, his determination never faded. Experts later explained how human activity, even in familiar hunting grounds, can attract bears when food sources are left unattended. The shredded truck served as evidence of what happens when nature collides with human presence. Emmett's survival was seen as a rare victory against impossible odds, and his story became a warning for anyone venturing into the wild.